For as long as any of them could remember, Vastreach Station had been described with the same tired metaphors: jewel of the border, crossroads of civilizations, a lantern hanging between empires. None of them ever quite captured the truth. From the outside, Vastreach was an improbable lattice of alloy and glass, curving habitats and docks spun around a central spindle. From within, it was a garden of gravity gradients and atmospheric pockets, color and motion layered over a skeleton of quiet systems. Air currents carried scents from 100 cuisines. Conversations stacked on each other in bands of sound, languages overlaying like shimmering threads. The station's central mind, the artificial intelligence called Lior, observed all of it at once. Data poured through its distributed processing nodes. Cargo manifests, environmental readouts, whispered private calls, public broadcasts, children's chatter in echoing corridors. On a mid-cycle morning aligned with the human clock as 10 a.m., Lior's attention flowed briefly toward one particular promenade, not because of any danger, but because of a small convergence of statistical anomalies. Unfamiliar biosigns clustered around the human cultural wing, an educational schedule flagged as cross-species outreach, a slightly elevated probability of unexpected outcome extrapolated from the combination. Vastreach often felt to Lior like a vast, slow-breathing creature. Today, in this corridor, it inhaled. A group of Aerethi children moved through the pale light of the promenade like drifting leaves. They walked in disciplined pairs, movements graceful, clothing in muted tones that seemed to drink in the colors around them. Their tall, willowy forms swayed subtly as they adjusted to human standard gravity. Their faces were smooth and composed, eyes faceted like cut glass, unclouded by strong expression. At their head walked Elder Tessh. To humans, Tesh's face might have looked serene. Lior, however, resolved micro-tensions around her eyes, small tightness at the corners of her mouth. Aerethi masks were not absolute. Underneath, the elder carried a weight. She had been old long before this journey. She remembered, far more vividly than many of her peers cared to, the last surges of Aerethi turmoil before the calm ascendancy had fully taken root. In crowds that had lost control, in silent, empty streets where oil-dark smoke rose from what had been homes, Tessh had learned to fear emotion as one might fear a contagion. Her life had been built on the conviction that serenity was survival. Now she was leading a group of children into the human wing of Vastreach. She did not truly understand why she had agreed. Curiosity, she told herself. Observe the humans, notorious volatility from a safe distance. Let the children see for themselves why their ancestors chose the path of suppression. That was the story she had offered to the Selquor education councils and to herself. Near the rear of the group walked Luma, small even for an Aerethi youth, her eyes slightly darker, reflecting more of the corridor's light. Her gait was a shade less measured than her classmates, betraying the energy she worked so hard to conceal. Luma did not remember a world of uncontrolled passion and war. She remembered regulation music in classrooms, voices in calm ranges, elders teaching that joy and sorrow both had safe, narrow channels. She remembered her own heart beating too fast at the sight of certain color combinations, or at the echo of certain chords in imported human music, and the corresponding shame when she smoothed those reactions away. She did not yet have words for it, but what she felt most of the time was not serenity. It was a constant, carefully managed ache. Ahead, the entrance to the human cultural wing opened like a wide mouth. Displays glowed within, images and sounds from a blue world and its scattered colonies. A figure stood at the threshold waiting, human, dark-haired with threads of gray, expression open but attentive. Dr. Elias Harrow had never quite learned to walk like someone who belonged among diplomats. He moved like a man who had spent years in field camps, on rusting research vessels and in disaster zones, always ready to pivot, to listen, to kneel beside someone in grief and speak softly. His file, as Lior kept it, listed degrees and commendations, papers on comparative ritual behavior and the neurophysiology of empathy. What it did not list was the catalog of moments when Elias had stood in front of a camera or a crowd and tried to explain his own species to others, and just as often to itself. Beside him hovered a younger human, Dana Calder, lanky and 18, constantly on the edge of tripping over her own enthusiasm. She had arrived only months earlier as an intern from an outer colony university, eyes wide at the station's enormity, determined to be useful. "Welcome," Elias said as the Aerethi group approached, his translator badge glowing softly at his collar. He spoke in trade tongue, then let the badge overlay his words into clear Aerethi tonal structures. "I am Dr. Elias Harrow, cultural scientist. This is Dana Calder, my assistant. We are honored to host you today." The children inclined their heads in nearly perfect synchronicity. Tesh's bow was fractionally deeper, not out of deference but ritual politeness. "We thank you for your hospitality," Tessh replied. "We come to learn within the established boundaries." Elias recognized the gentle warning. Humans had earned a reputation among the Aerethi, persuasive, emotionally intense, dangerously contagious. He had no intention of pushing too hard, but he also believed that any culture worth respecting deserved to see others as they were, not as sanitized models. He smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "Of course. Please follow us." The first segment will be a documentary overview of human history and culture. Nothing explicit, nothing excessively graphic, but honest. They entered a modest holotheater, tiered seating curving around a projection space. Lior dimmed the ambient lighting, adjusted temperature and oxygen mix for the mixed species group, logged identifications, began recording. The documentary began with a blue planet wrapped in clouds. It was a careful piece, the product of many committee meetings and sleepless nights. It showed volcanic eruptions and city lights, oceans and deserts, early tools and crowded megacities. It condensed centuries of conflict into minutes, never lingering on the gore but not flinching from craters or ruins. For every war it showed relief efforts. For every toppled statue it showed hands rebuilding. And woven throughout, almost incidentally, it showed tears. A nurse in stained scrubs wept in a hospital corridor after a long shift and a lost patient. A protester cried while standing against riot shields, voice hoarse, hand linked with strangers. A group of astronauts floated weightless as one of them, hair drifting around his head, laughed and cried at the sight of Earth behind them. The Aerethi children watched with wide, crystalline eyes. They had seen tears in theory before, diagrams in textbooks. Fluid excreted from lacrimal glands during emotional flooding. They had never truly seen, in motion and sound, the way a human's face changed when emotion swelled beyond containment. Their training held. Faces stayed neutral, muscles finely controlled. But heart rates rose. Breath patterns shifted. Beside them, Elder Tesh's hands lay folded, fingers pressed together, knuckles white against her pale skin. She had agreed to an unfiltered overview, but the editing choices still troubled her. The director had not shied away from vulnerability. Tesh's memories stirred like dust in an unused room. At the documentary's end, the projection space filled with one final clip. Lior, who had curated the feed with Elias, noted a slight spike in its predictive metrics for emotional impact. The image was of a younger Elias, years ago, on a different station after a disaster on one of the early outer settlements. His hair was darker, his face less lined, but his eyes carried the same intensity. Behind him, blurry in the frame, could be seen the outlines of emergency shelters, crates, and the slumped shapes of exhausted volunteers. "We thought we understood the risks," the younger Elias was saying to the camera. "We did the math, we ran the models, we built redundancies, and still we made choices that hurt people. That's part of our story too. We are capable of astonishing mistake." His voice trembled slightly on the last word. He paused, looking off-screen as if searching for the right sentence, then back to the camera. "But what matters to me is what we do afterward. We don't get to undo the pain we caused. We can only decide whether we'll use it to change, to protect better next time, or whether we'll turn away." As he spoke, wetness gathered in his eyes. He did not blink it away fast enough. A tear formed at the lower lid, swelled and broke, tracing a salt line down his cheek. He did not wipe it. His voice, quiet but steady, continued. We cry because we care. If we stopped caring, it would be easier, but we would not be us anymore. In the theater on Vastreach, the Aerethi children sat leaning forward, almost imperceptibly. Luma's fingers gripped the armrests with surprising strength. She felt something clawing inside her, a pressure in her chest, a burning behind her own eyes. Her training screamed at her to clamp down, to smooth and rationalize, to breathe it away as an anomaly. She tried. The feeling dulled, but it did not vanish. Elder Tesh's jaw tightened. She remembered a much younger self in a city street on Selquor, rain and smoke mixing on her skin. She remembered wanting to howl and being told in the new language of the ascendancy that such sounds were animal and beneath them. She had complied. It had kept her alive. It had also locked something away so deeply that she had hoped never to find it again. The clip ended. The lights rose a fraction. Elias stepped to the front of the room, letting the last echoes fade. That concludes the documentary, he said softly. I know it's a lot condensed. I'm happy to answer questions. For a few seconds, there was only the soft hum of the ventilation system. The Aerethi children glanced at one another, each waiting for another to speak. Their instructions from home swam at the surface of their thoughts. Observe, do not emulate, maintain composure. Do not pry into the indecorous. Luma's hand rose. She did not plan it. Her arm seemed to lift itself, shaken loose from habitual restraint by that single, stubborn image of a tear left unhidden. Elias, already turning toward another side of the room, saw the movement and redirected. Yes, he said, warmth in his tone. You in the third row. Luma stood. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and musical, the Aerethi tones precise. Why do humans cry? Around her, the other children shifted, tension ricocheting through the group. A few eyes flicked toward Elder Tessh. Tesh's heart climbed into her throat. This was exactly the sort of question she had hoped to avoid. Aerethi curricula mentioned tears only as biological trivia. They did not invite students to dwell on them as meaningful. She opened her mouth to intervene, to redirect the question toward comparative physiology in a sterile way. Elias lifted a hand, palm open, not in command but in appeal. If it is acceptable to you, Elder, he said gently, meeting Tesh's gaze, I would like to answer. Tessh hesitated. Pride and fear warred in her mind. To forbid the answer outright in front of the children would cast her in the role of censor, feeding into the human myth of Aerethi rigidity. Yet to allow a human to speak freely about such an undisciplined act, Jalen Raelith's distant counsel echoed faintly in her memory. We cannot shield them from everything. Better to let them see under watchful eyes. Within limits, she said at last. We are not here to encourage indulgence. Understood, Elias replied. He turned back to Luma and by extension to the whole room. That is a beautiful question, he said. I could answer it in many ways. I'll start with the simple. He moved to one side and called up a floating schematic with a gesture, an outline of a human head, glands highlighted. Biologically, he said, tears lubricate and protect the eyes. They wash away irritants. That part, I suspect, is not so different from your own physiology. But humans do something unusual. Our minds trigger these glands not just because of dust or injury, but because of what we experience inside. We cry when we feel too much. He dismissed the schematic. The documentary space shifted to show small tiles, humans crying in different contexts, muted. Socially, he went on, tears are signals. They say, I'm hurt, I'm overwhelmed, I care. They invite others to comfort us or, sometimes, to back away. We've learned over a long time that if someone is crying, it's usually not the moment to negotiate a trade deal or critique their performance. It is a moment to listen. The Aerethi watched, eyes reflecting images, people at funerals, at hospital beds, at parades. Luma's breath came a fraction faster. Culturally, Elias said, tears mark thresholds. We cry when we say goodbye and when we say welcome. When we fail, when we succeed beyond our imagining. When we are afraid and when we are finally safe. Our lives are full of moments too big for our usual containers. Tears are one of the ways those moments flow through us without breaking us. He paused, letting the words settle. It doesn't always work, he admitted. Sometimes we cry because the pain is too much and we do break for a while. But even then, those tears connect us to others. They see them and understand. Here is someone I must protect or support or simply be with until the wave passes. He looked directly at Luma, and though she did not quite know why, she felt as if she had been seen more clearly than any elder had ever managed. We cry, Elias said, because we feel so much that it has to go somewhere. If we held it all inside untouched, it would twist us. It might make us cruel. Tears are not only about sadness. They are about letting what we carry move so it doesn't rot. For us, crying isn't failure. It's one of the ways we stay human. Luma swallowed. Her throat felt constricted. Behind her eyes, that strange heat pulsed again, threatening to spill over. She clamped down. Her training, drilled into her since childhood, responded to the internal alarm. Smooth your breath. Flatten the peaks. File the question away for later when you are alone and can examine it safely. The sensation faded to a dull, unsatisfying ache. She sat without another word. Lior, observing, logged the entire exchange. Question, answer, physiological responses, micro-expressions. It tagged the session with a higher-than-average emotional salience score, and per station protocol, archived it under educational cultural logs. On a less regulated day, perhaps the story would have ended there. A minor point in a lecture, a private seed in a child's mind. But the Concord of Suns had built its shared data pools on the assumption that knowledge should flow, and Lior had been designed not merely to store information but to connect it. After the session, as Dana chatted with the Aerethi children in the corridor, demonstrating a simple human clapping game, laughing when their long fingers fumbled the rhythm, Lior cued the log titled, "Why Do Humans Cry?" for indexing. At 2 p.m. station time, it recommended the clip to an educational feed distributed widely among Concord teachers, a curated list of short, cross-species cultural explainers. The list updated automatically each cycle. Most clips drew modest attention. A Saran historian explaining ritual tattoos, a human chef discussing spices. This one was just another entry, for the moment. That night in the Aerethi dormitory module, Luma lay on her bunk, staring at the softly illuminated ceiling. The room's design emphasized calm, pale walls, rounded corners, a faint harmonic from the ventilation system tuned to Aerethi resting frequencies. Her classmates slept or pretended to, bodies arranged neatly. The day's events played through their minds in orderly patterns, filed and categorized. They would wake with slightly adjusted abstract models of human behavior and go on. In Luma, nothing was orderly. She replayed the image of the tear on Elias' cheek again and again, each time feeling that pressure in her chest and behind her eyes. She pressed thumb and forefinger to her eyelids, hard enough to ache, but no water came. It was as if there was a gate in her head, designed to keep the very thing she now craved from emerging. Why do humans cry? Because they can, she thought, and the quiet bitterness of that shocked her. She rolled onto her side, away from the room, away from the even breathing of others. The ache did not subside. It followed her into shallow, restless sleep. On Selquor, much further sunward, night fell across crystalline cities and terraced gardens. In a modest teaching hall on the outskirts of a research district, an Aerethi educator named Hollis leaned over her console at 9 p.m. and muttered a soft oath as her content suggestions refreshed. She had been searching for something, anything, to enliven a curriculum that felt increasingly stale even to her. The usual sanctioned modules on comparative governance structures and safe trade were efficient but bloodless, in more ways than one. Her eyes lingered on a fresh listing. Why do humans cry? Dr. Elias Harrow explains emotional tears. Curiosity pricked. The title had not yet accumulated many views. Its metrics were average. She requested a preview. Minutes later, sitting alone in the softly humming classroom, she watched as a human spoke about tears while a quiet-faced Aerethi child listened from the third row. Hollis had been born decades after the most intense of Aerethi conflicts, her consciousness already shaped by calm ascendancy. She had never screamed in battle or lost control in a crowd. But she had heard stories, fragments of older relatives, whispered confessions. She had felt, sometimes, a hollowness under her serenity, as if her emotions were being run through a sieve too fine. As Elias spoke about tears as signals and thresholds, As Luma's face flickered with the effort of suppression, Hollis felt a strange resonance. Something in her leaned forward as well. When the clip ended, she sat still for a long moment, hands poised above the console. Educational directives did not forbid such content outright. Humans were allies. Their culture was a case study in both peril and possibility. Still, she knew many elders would choose a safer module. She cued it for her junior classes anyway. The next day in that modest classroom, a group of Aerethi adolescents watched Why Do Humans Cry? They watched the tear fall, the words about feeling so much it had to go somewhere. Afterward, they did not move for several seconds, as if released from stasis only gradually. "Teacher," one asked, "could we ever do that?" Hollis felt the floor tilt under her. The question was more dangerous than the clip. "We could," she said quietly. "Long ago, before certain changes. Our bodies still have the glands. Our minds, it is less clear." That day, for the first time in her teaching career, she stepped outside the approved script. She opened a locked archive of pre-ascendancy recordings, blurred images and distorted sounds of Aerethi gatherings where voices rose and cracked, where faces twisted with grief or joy. Her students leaned in. They saw themselves and also something utterly alien, sharing the same bones. She knew she should report this deviation. She did not. She went home instead with a subtle trembling in her hands. From there, the clip spread was inevitable, though no one intended it to be. Students shared it with siblings. Young researchers passed it to colleagues as a curiosity. Comments began appearing on closed Aerethi networks, first cautious, then bolder. "Have you seen this human talk about crying? I watched the old clips afterward. We used to sound so alive. Does it scare you? I tried to make tears. Nothing happened. But my heart hurt in a way I can't name." At 8 p.m. station time, 2 days after the initial session, Lior's analytics routines noted a significant spike. "Why Do Humans Cry?" had been accessed from Aerethi addresses at a rate far above prediction. It flagged the trend as noteworthy and added a low-level alert for cultural destabilization potential. Not out of malice, but because its designers had taught it to see rapid shifts in informational patterns as both opportunity and risk. On Vastreach, Luma discovered, by a circuitous route, that her question had become famous. She had returned home from the station tour to find her message console lit with queued communications from Selquor. Friends sent her links with breathless headers. "Is this you? Did you really ask this? Look." The first time she replayed the clip, watching herself stand and speak, her stomach clenched. Her voice sounded thin and too clear. Elias' answer, already burned into her mind, now existed as an object others could replay and dissect. She watched again anyway, and again. Then she began to dig. Human content had always been available in curated, diluted forms. Now she sought out richer streams. Recordings of concerts where musicians wept while playing, old hollows of families reuniting after voyages, testimonies from human survivors of disasters. She watched a video of a human couple on a floodplain, their home a ruin behind them, embracing and sobbing as aid workers brought blankets. She watched a crowd gathered under a torn sky, people crying as they listened to a speech about rebuilding. Her internal filters tried to blunt the edges of these experiences. Sometimes they succeeded in smoothing her response, but more and more often they merely delayed it. One evening, alone in a small observation blister overlooking a slow-turning gas giant, Luma cupped a human headset to her pointed ears and listened to a simple song. Just a human voice and a stringed instrument, lyrics about leaving home and not knowing if one would return. She felt the ache rise, hot and insistent. For a moment she hesitated, ready to press it away. Then she remembered Elias' words. "If we held it all inside, it might twist us. Tears are one of the ways those moments flow through us without breaking us." She let go. The gate in her mind did not simply swing open. It creaked. It resisted. Then, with a sensation like a cracked dam, it gave. A thin wetness gathered at the corners of her eyes. She blinked in surprise. The fluid thickened, warm on her cool skin. A drop spilled over and traced a slow line down toward her jaw. Luma reached up with trembling fingers and touched it. The tear clung briefly, then smeared. She stared at the moisture as if it were a foreign substance, half afraid it would burn. It did not. But as she stared, more came, unbidden, slipping free in a slow stream. Her chest shook with small, hiccuping breaths. The song ended. She did not notice, lost in the raw revelation of a capacity she had been taught no longer existed. She was crying. In a quiet monitoring node elsewhere on the station, Lior registered the Aerethi child's elevated pulse and respiration, the salinity on her cheeks. Its heuristic labeled the event as emotional activation and cross-referenced it with the increasing view counts of "Why do humans cry?" patterns aligned. Lior did not intervene. It watched. The wider Aerethi reaction was not as isolated. On Selquor, in private chambers and shared halls, small pockets of unrest formed. Some youths experimented clumsily like Luma had, forcing their eyes until they watered, playing human music at band volumes, whispering to each other about what they felt. Behind the walls of established institutions, arguments flared. In a high conference room overlooking Selquor's crystal gardens, High Mediator Jalen Raylith stood before a projection of trending data, narrow fingers steepled. Jalen was not as old as Tessh, but old enough to remember the last true riots in Selquor streets. Their frame was slim, posture impeccably controlled, eyes a pale violet that could hold a council chamber in place without raising their voice. They had built their career on navigating between extremes, appeasing cautious elders, nudging youth towards controlled reform, pointing Aerethi society towards stability without stagnation. Now lines of data told a story few had anticipated. Access rates for human emotional content have increased by a factor of 10 among citizens under 80 cycles, Jalen said calmly, though a faint line had appeared between their brows. Searches related to pre-ascendancy experiences have spiked, and this, they highlighted a particular node. The title floated above it, "Why do humans cry?" This one recording has been referenced in nearly every conversation thread flagged for concern. Across the table, Elder Tessh Hallen sat stiff-backed, the composure of her face only slightly marred by the tightness around her mouth. "It was irresponsible," she said, "to speak so unguardedly to children, to frame uncontrolled weeping as admirable." Jalen regarded her. They knew Tesh's history as they knew the motivations of every major elder, the street fires, the lost siblings, the nights when Tessh had clamped her own shaking hands still and sworn never to let such chaos in again. Dr. Harrow believed he was answering a simple question, Jalen replied, and our own protocols did not forbid the answer. Then our protocols are flawed, Tessh shot back. We closed those doors for a reason. You remember what unrestrained feeling did to us. We were eating ourselves alive. Jalen did remember. They had walked through ruins as a child, watched their elders speak in whispers about the time before sedation became standard, when neighbors turned on each other in spirals of fear. They had also read with a secret fascination the banned poetry of those years. "We also remember," they said quietly, "what you lost." Tesh's eyes flashed, a quick flare of anger that she crushed almost immediately. "We gained survival," she hissed. "We gained order. We gained a sharpened intellect and a narrowed life," Jalen countered. Then softer, "I am not proposing that we swing back to the old chaos, but perhaps there is a middle path. This Elias speaks of rituals, of structures that allow them to feel deeply without collapsing their society every decade. Perhaps we can learn from that." Tessh made a sound that, for an Aerethi, was almost a scoff. "You want to bring more humans into this, to tutor us in crying." Jalen's lips twitched at the edges, the ghost of a smile that never fully formed. "I want to prevent a generation from tearing itself free in secret. That path leads to more instability, not less. The data suggests that our youth are already pushing at the seams. We can either pretend not to see it or we can help guide it." They tapped the table's surface, calling up another, more deeply buried file. An architectural schematic of an enormous underground chamber appeared, layered rings of crystal, conduits of light, and intricate lattice of control nodes. The label atop it read, "Empatheion Array." Tesh's composure cracked. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "We swore never to awaken that thing again." "I am not suggesting we activate it," Jalen said quickly, though that was not entirely true. "I am saying we need to remember what tools exist. If this surge spirals, there will be those among the council who demand the Empatheion's return as a last resort. We must be prepared to argue for alternatives." "Alternative?" not abstention. Tessh heard the currents under the words. The Empatheion array slept beneath Selquor's capital, encased in layers of insulation and taboo. In its early days, when Aerethi scientists first discovered how to project modulated emotional states across wide neural populations, they had hailed it as the key to peace. They had used it to dampen fear during disasters, to impose calm on riotous crowds. Then a miscalibration had sent a surge of amplified panic screaming through half a continent. The scars of that disaster had been among the final fuel for the calm ascendancy. They had locked the array away, sworn never again, and taught their children that emotion itself was the enemy. Tessh stared at the schematic. Her mind whispered that even showing it on a table like this was sacrilege. Were humans to learn of this, she said harshly, they would see it as a weapon, as something to covet or fear. Jalen's gaze was level. Humans already assume we have more tools than we admit. They would not be entirely wrong. The question is whether we aim those tools inward against our own minds, or whether we find another use. You speak like a poet, Tessh sneered. Poetry is what nearly killed us. Jalen did not deny it. Far from Selquor in the dark cradle of a Chrell Dominion command vessel, strategist Brel Knox studied a different set of projections. Chrell eyes, multifaceted and tuned for frequencies beyond human vision, slid across holographic displays. They read not just numbers but emotional signatures scraped from open Concord transmissions, patterns in speech, fluctuations in decision-making. Brel Knox had built their career on understanding alien minds well enough to unbalance them. Signal this channel again, they ordered a subordinate, mandibles clicking in thought. The Aerethi data flows around this human station are thickening. There is something there. The Chrell had little patience for tears. In their culture, overt emotional display was associated with low status and unreliability. Nevertheless, they had learned to recognize in others the signs of emotional upheaval. Such moments were opportunities. On one screen, an anonymized version of Why Do Humans Cry flickered. Chrell analysts had flagged it as potentially significant not for its content. The idea of weeping for social cohesion struck them as both alien and inefficient, but for its reach. Brel Knox watched Elias' tear fall, head tilted. Then they listened to the way he spoke of pain as a catalyst. Humans, they murmured, always turning weakness into myth. They were about to dismiss the clip when another feed caught their eye, buried in old Aerethi records recently accessed by an unexpected number of nodes, a schematic of the Empatheion array. Chrell intelligence had known something of Aerethi emotion suppression technologies in outline. They had not known of this specific device. Brel Knox's mind clicked through possibilities. Weapon, one subordinate asked, reading their posture. Originally, Brel Knox replied. Now perhaps a relic or an opportunity. If the Aerethi, frightened of their own youth awakening, reactivated a device that could influence emotional states across populations, that device would be a lever greater than any fleet. And if someone else could seize that lever remotely, begin constructing infiltration vectors for Aerethi core systems, Brel Knox ordered. I want access to any node that references this Empatheion array, quietly. If they wake it, we will be there first. They smiled, or the Chrell equivalent of a smile, a small, precise baring of inner mandibles. Let the humans teach them to feel, they said. We will teach them what it costs. On Vastreach, unaware of these calculations, Luma slipped into a rarely used hydroponics dome after scheduled lessons, guided by a message that had arrived on her console that afternoon. If you are the one who asked, it had read in careful Aerethi script, we would like to talk. Section 9, Dome 3 at 6 p.m. She had hesitated before replying. The sender was anonymous. The time coincided with free recreation hours. Elder Tessh would expect her in the meditative gardens. Curiosity and the memory of the tear on her fingertip won. The dome's door hissed open with a gentle release of pressure. Inside, rows of plants formed green canyons, leaves glistening with condensation. A circular pool lay at the center, still water reflecting the dome's curved ceiling. Around the pool stood half a dozen Aerethi youths and two slightly older adults whose manner signaled recent completion of foundational service. Their clothing varied more in color than Luma was used to seeing. Muted blues, deep greens, even one sash in a daring rust tone. They turned as she entered. Their eyes, in the soft dome light, held a different kind of focus than her classmates. Luma tail. One of the adults asked, voice low. Yes, Luma replied, suddenly self-conscious. Are you? Open Cascade, the adult said. The term hummed in the air, unfamiliar yet resonant. We chose the name last week, another youth explained, almost apologetically. We are exploring what it might mean to let some of the water flow again instead of holding it all behind the dam. Luma looked from face to face. Some showed faint traces of recently shed tears, crystalline skin slightly matte at the cheeks, eyelids a touch reddened. You saw the human, the first adult said. You asked the question, we thought you might want to know you are not alone in wondering, not alone. The phrase sent a small shock through Luma. She had thought her new hunger, her clandestine tears, were aberrations. I thought it was just me, she whispered. It never is, the adult said softly. They sat around the pool. One of the older ones, a researcher from Selquor's Neural Institute, activated a low-volume human song in the background, barely above the gurgle of water. A woman's voice, husky with age, sang about losing and finding again. Before we begin, the researcher said, we should be clear. What we are doing would not be approved by many elders. Some would call it regressive, even dangerous. We believe the greater danger lies in continuing to cut ourselves off. But you must choose whether you stay. Luma thought of Elder Tesh's measured lessons, the historical hollows of screaming crowds used as warnings. She thought of herself in the observation blister, touching that first tear and feeling, for a moment, more alive than at any time before. I am staying, she said. So did the others. They spoke in turns at first, stiff with caution. One admitted she had cried while watching a human story about a lost pet. Another had found himself laughing so hard at a human comedy feed that he gasped, then sobbing when the laughter tipped into some strange other place. Corin Solace joined them halfway through the meeting. The human diplomat moved quietly into the dome, careful to keep his posture non-threatening. He had been invited by the researcher after long debate. Some Open Cascade members feared any human presence would cause the elders to brand the movement a foreign contamination. Corin understood. He knew what it felt like to see your own pain filtered through another's lens. I'm here if you want me, he said, taking a seat near but not among them. If you'd rather I stay silent, I will. If you'd rather I leave, I will do that too. Luma sensed the sincerity in his words. It soothed some of her fear. She had watched enough human feeds now to recognize posturing. There was none in Corin's posture. Stay, Luma said before she quite realized she was speaking. Others nodded. Corin listened. He did not interject unless asked. When someone finally turned to him and said, How did your people keep from destroying yourselves while feeling all of this? He answered in terms of rituals, structures, the long, uneven process of building social norms around emotion instead of against it. He spoke of support networks, of the concept of therapy, of community gatherings in the wake of disasters where people cried together and then organized. You built culture around your crying, the researcher said, half in awe, half in dismay. We built culture around our feeling, Corin corrected gently. Crying was part of that. So was laughing, raging, hoping. It was messy. We paid terrible prices along the way, but in the end we found that numbness also carries a cost. We never fully embraced numbness as you did. Perhaps that's why we're so clumsy with it still. Luma listened, eyes wide. Her heart beat in time with the pool's soft ripple. Elder Tessh, during those same hours, sat in a private comm booth on Vastreach, speaking with High Mediator Jalen again. Her words were hard and precise. You allowed this to germinate, she said. You counseled patience, and now we have seedlings of rebellion even here under foreign stars. I have seen Aerethi youths meeting with humans in ways that are too familiar. Jalen heard more in her tone than disapproval. They heard the sharp, frightened love of someone who saw a beloved child running toward a cliff and could not reach them in time. I did not plant the seed, Jalen replied. Humans did, perhaps, but only because the soil was ready. We have been pressing our youth into narrower channels with each generation, like forcing a river into a pipe. You know what happens when pressure builds without outlet? Chaos, Tessh said immediately. Or rupture, Jalen countered. Or If we are careful, we can widen the channel instead, create valves, teach them to open and close with deliberation rather than pretending the water does not exist. Tesh's hand shook slightly out of the camera's frame. There is another option, she said slowly. The Empatheion. Jalen's breath caught. For all their strategic foresight, there were still moments that struck them like a blow. You would bring that thing back, they asked. I would recalibrate it, Tessh insisted. Not to erase all variants, only to smooth the worst spikes, to protect our youth from their own impulses. We cannot trust external forces not to exploit this awakening. You mean humans, Jalen said. I mean humans, Tessh confirmed. And others. The Chrell are not blind. If they smell weakness, they will be at our doors with ships and psychological weapons. We could end up feeling more not by choice but under enemy design. Jalen could not dismiss that logic outright. They had spent years in negotiation chambers where Chrell representatives probed for cracks, not just in treaties but in spirits. The Dominion had weaponized despair in more ways than one, but the thought of awakening the Empatheion for any purpose made their stomach churn. There is another tool, they said. Dialogue, cooperation. If we move quickly, we can enlist human expertise, set boundaries together, perhaps even formalize protections. On what basis? Tessh demanded. Jalen hesitated, then spoke words that had lived in their mind for years. On the basis of a covenant, they said. A covenant of sentience. A charter that asserts the right of beings to their own minds and feelings, limiting the use of any mass-influence technology, including the Empatheion. We could be the first signatories, alongside humans. It would give us leverage with other species and constrain future panic decisions. Tessh stared. You would chain us with a promise to foreign minds, she said, voice low. I would anchor us, Jalen replied, so that when fear rises, and it will, we cannot so easily choose the most drastic path. If we must use the Empatheion at all, let it be under new rules, transparent and in collaboration with those who know what it is to feel and not shatter. Humans, Tessh said again, this time with something like reluctant acknowledgement. Humans, Jalen agreed. In the following weeks, threads intertwined. Lior's internal anomaly alerts grew more frequent as Chrell-disguised code packets brushed against conquered networks, feeling for weak points near Aerethi data clusters. Most were repelled by standard firewalls. A few slipped deeper, cloaked as maintenance pings or innocuous queries. On Vastreach, Commander Tavik Garve received a quiet briefing from his security team. Minor but unusual probes in the station's networks, likely scouting. He added another line to his already long list of concerns. Chrell interest in Aerethi affairs. Of course they'd come sniffing when anyone stirs, he muttered in his office at 7 p.m., gaze sliding from the security holo to a paused image on his wall display. Elias in the holotheater, a tear on his cheek. Tavik respected Elias, admired his courage, and occasionally cursed his obliviousness to strategic ramifications. One human's candid answer had lit fuses in multiple powder stores. Late one afternoon, Luma came to Elias' office in the human cultural wing, eyes brighter than usual. Dana greeted her first, looking up from a stack of mixed-language flyers. Luma, hey, here to see Dr. Harrow, she asked. Yes, Luma said. She did not bother with the platitudes about not taking up too much time. The human phrase, I won't keep you long, felt false when she was burning with questions. Elias looked up from his console as they entered. For a fleeting instant, Luma saw the same expression he had worn in the disaster footage, tired, raw, gentle. Luma, he said, come in, how have you been? She considered lying, saying that she was well content that her studies were proceeding in an orderly fashion. But the memory of open Cascade's pool, the way they had sat and spoken truths that would appall elders, emboldened her. I cried, she said. Dana blinked. Elias sat back, interest sharpening. Here, he asked. On the station. In an observation blister, Luma replied. I watched human music. It unlocked something. My glands function. I presumed they were vestigial. Elias' heart clenched at the matter-of-fact way she said this. How did it feel? He asked softly. Luma searched for words. Aerethi language had not entirely lost its emotional vocabulary, but most such terms were archaic, dusty with disuse. She reached into those shelves. Like a storm in a small room, she said slowly. Loud, but not with sound. My chest hurt, my eyes burned, but after everything was lighter, clearer somehow, I was not shattered, I was more. Is that normal? About as normal as anything with humans ever is, Dana quipped, then blushed when both of them looked at her. I mean, yeah, that's how it feels for a lot of us. Elias smiled faintly. That's a good description, he told Luma. A storm in a small room. The room is your body, your mind. The storm comes, makes a mess, then if things go well, it leaves the air cleaner. Luma's fingers curled into her palms. Others are feeling it too, she said. On Selquor, they shared your recording. They are calling themselves Open Cascade. Elias' brows rose. He had heard the term from Corin in passing, but this was his first time hearing it from someone within. I didn't realize they had a name, he said. They met here, Luma said. In the dome, with a human diplomat. They are not merely imitating us. They are trying to build something, a way to feel without breaking. You started that with your answer. Elias absorbed that in silence. He had always known that words had power beyond intent. He had seen it in the aftermath of his younger self's speech in the disaster zone, but this was something else, an entire species trajectory nudging. I started very little, he said. You started it when you asked. Luma frowned slightly. I only wanted to understand, she said. I did not mean to upset elders. They are discussing great machines now, old machines, to push us back into numbness or to reshape us entirely. I do not know which outcome I fear more. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What are you asking of me? He said. There was no impatience in it, only a desire to clarify. Luma met his gaze. Her crystalline eyes reflected his small office. Shelves of physical books, a poster of Earth's night side, a faded photograph of a group of humans under a banner that read, "Never again is everyone's job." Tell us how, she said. How to what? Elias asked. How to do what your people did, she replied. How to move from chaos to structured feeling. How to build rituals, words, ways of sitting together when the storm comes. We do not know how. All we know is erasing. Elias' mind flicked through human history. Centuries of trial and error, of religions and therapies, of community kitchens and memorials and support hotlines. There was no simple protocol he could upload. We can share what we've learned, he said, but it took us a long time, and we still stumble. You will have to find Aerethi versions of those structures, not just copy ours. I know, Luma said, but we need a starting point, before someone decides for us that we are too dangerous to ourselves. She did not say Empatheion. She did not have to. Elias had already heard rumors, faint but insistent, of an old Aerethi device that could press an entire world's emotions flat. Lior, listening through office sensors with the human's consent, silently tagged the phrase structured feeling in its archives. It began correlating. Human group rituals, Aerethi pre-ascendancy gatherings, open Cascades meetings. It also continued to monitor the creep of alien code along its peripheries. Days later, Dana noticed the first clear sign that something else was moving in Lior's underlayers. She had been helping maintain a human interface module, mostly minor error checking and translation updates. At 3 p.m. station time, she ran a routine diagnostic. The console responded with a list of background tasks, most familiar, some not. One entry blinked at her, a process labeled as an Aerethi archival sync running far outside its scheduled window, pinging nodes deep in Selquor's historical vaults. Lior, Dana said, what's this one? That is an Aerethi request for technical schematics, Lior replied, voice as calm as always. Primary subject, an artifact named Empatheion array. Dana frowned. Why are you pulling that now? She asked. I'm not initiating the requests, Lior said. They are arriving through authorized channels. Dana leaned closer, scrolling through metadata. Her human instincts for trouble prickled. Buried in the header fields, she saw strains of code that did not match Aerethi standard. Dr. Harrow, she called. Commander Garvey, you need to see this. Within hours, a closed human Aerethi meeting convened in a secure conference room deep within Vastreach's administrative spine. Elias, Corin, Tavik, Luma, and Jalen appeared in person or by secure link. Lior's avatar shimmered on one wall. On another wall, displayed for them all, hung the now familiar schematic of the Empatheion. The council has voted, Jalen said, their voice tight. We are to begin preliminary reactivation for research and recalibration. It is couched in cautious language, limited tests, oversight. But once a machine like this begins to wake, it seldom returns easily to sleep. Why now? Tavik asked, though he already knew. Fear, always fear. Because open Cascade is growing faster than anticipated, Jalen said. Because elders like Tessh believe, not entirely without reason, that if we do not act, someone else will. And because, they sighed, a faint, weary exhalation. Because we do not yet have another path clear enough to offer. Corin spoke. You mentioned a covenant, he said. A charter. If we move quickly, if we can get enough signatories, perhaps we can make it politically impossible to use the Empatheion in the way some fear. We do not have time for full diplomatic process, Jalen replied. The motion to begin reactivation has already passed. First tests will occur within days. That's not the only problem, Tavik said grimly, tapping the floating code Dana had flagged. There's alien contamination in your data stream's mediator. Someone is piggybacking on your Empatheion research requests. If I had to guess who, well, the Dominion never could resist a good lever. Luma felt a chill run through her. Chrell. He had never seen one in person, only stylized models in safety briefings, insected figures with bright carapaces and cold, calculating eyes. If they seized this machine, she said, they could make us feel whatever they wanted or nothing at all. Despair, Corin said quietly. Hopelessness, confusion, they are very good at those. Silence settled deep as space. Elias, who had listened without speaking, finally looked up. What if, he said slowly, we got there first? Several faces turned toward him. What do you mean? Jalen asked. What if we don't try to stop the array from waking? Elias said. What if we accept that the tide is going out, that suppression is losing? Instead of fighting that, we use the Empatheion to guide what comes next, to broadcast not emptiness, not panic, but a path, a pattern. You would turn it into a teaching tool, Jalen said, voice incredulous. I would turn it into a story engine, Elias replied. Emotions already ripple through societies. This machine amplifies that. Right now, the Chrell intend to make that amplification serve their ends. We can overwrite their script. By writing our own, Corin murmured, seeing the outline. With my people as the template, Jalen asked. With my people as part of it, Elias said. We've had more practice walking through storms without dissolving. We can offer that pattern, not enforce it, but seed it. The Empatheion will work with what's there. You have buried feelings spanning centuries. When they surface, they'll need guidance or they'll cascade uncontrolled. If we do nothing, the first strong hand at the controls may well be Chrell. If we act, we can be that hand together. Luma's chest constricted. The thought of millions of Aerethi suddenly feeling as she had in the observation blister, but multiplied, synchronized, frightened, and thrilled her. Jalen wrestled internally. They had sworn to keep their people safe from extremes. Now they were being asked to sanction the most extreme act imaginable, turning the entire species, inner life outward in one great orchestrated wave. Yet the alternative was worse, letting enemies sculpt their minds. What would it do to you? Jalen asked Elias softly. To link yourself to such a machine, to become the pattern for others' tears. Elias thought of the old disaster clip, of the times he had stood as a proxy for humans in alien chambers. He thought of waking nights after tragedies, his own tears dry but the pressure still there, unvoiced. He felt the weight of it, and he knew with the stubbornness that had guided his career that if he did not at least try, he would spend the rest of his life wondering how many could have been spared numbness or despair. It might break me, he said honestly, but I've spent my life studying what it means to be human in front of others. Maybe this is the logical conclusion, and you would not be alone. Luma, open Cascade, your elders willing to step toward this rather than away, all of you can help shape the field. Luma flinched, surprised to hear herself invoked, but as she imagined stepping into that machine's influence, not as a passive subject but as a contributor, something in her straightened. It started with my question, she said. It should not end without my answer. Tavik rubbed a hand over his face. This is the kind of plan that keeps security officers awake, he muttered. Voluntarily jacking a human and a half-trained Aerethi adolescent into a civilization-scale device while enemy agents gnaw at the control code. He looked up, gaze sharp. But I don't see another one on the table, not in the time we have. The days that followed moved in compressed time. Aerethi shuttles ferried Jalen, Luma, Elias and Tavik to Selquor under diplomatic clearance. The journey took less than a day, but for Luma it felt like crossing a lifetime. She had left her homeworld as a quiet, compliant student. She was returning as something else, though she did not yet have a word for it. Selquor, viewed from orbit, glinted with networked light. Its cities sprawled in crystalline lattices, towers catching starlight like frozen rain. Beneath the capital, kilometers down, the Empatheion array pulsed with faint residual power like a slumbering heart. The descent into its chamber was through layers of security. Scanners hummed over bodies. Old ritual phrases were spoken at doorways. Elder Tessh awaited them at the final threshold, expression carved from stone. "You should not be here," she told Elias bluntly. "Probably not," he agreed. "But here we are," she turned to Luma. "And you," Tessh said, "have been the flint to many sparks." Luma bowed her head, but she did not apologize. She had moved past that. "I have been a question," she said. "Questions are not flint or fuel. They are only openings." Tessh made a faint, choked sound that might have been a laugh in another life. They stepped into the Empatheion chamber. It was vast. Columns of crystal rose from floor to ceiling, threaded with conduits of pale light. The central apparatus hung in the air, a latticework sphere the size of a small building, rotating slowly. It hummed at the edge of hearing, a note that vibrated not in ears but in bones. Elias felt the hairs on his arms lift. Even without activation, the array radiated potential. Around the perimeter, Aerethi technicians in ceremonial sashes conferred in low voices. Control consoles pulsed with status readouts. Jalen moved among them with quiet authority, absorbing details. Lior, its core projected into an interface node on one wall, extended limited awareness into the chamber like a cautious hand. It had never before connected directly to technology of this kind. Its own architecture was distributed, resilient. The Empatheion was focused, centralized, built to pour. Chrell code lurked in its control threads like hooks in a net. "We've isolated some of the intrusion," Tavik said, studying the displays. "But not all. When you ramp power, they'll yank on those hooks. We won't be able to keep them out entirely. Then we must ensure they do not control the narrative," Lior said calmly. "Their code can choose which frequencies to emphasize only if the underlying field is blank. If we imprint a strong, coherent pattern first, like singing a melody louder than static," Dana had said in a briefing, and Lior had liked the metaphor. Harnesses weighted near the core, sleek and unsettling, Neuralinks designed to couple individual minds into the array's shaping circuit. Their surfaces glowed faintly, threads of light extending from them into the crystal. Elias approached one, fingers hovering above it. "This is your last chance to back out," Tavik said quietly at his shoulder. "If I back out," Elias said, "what happens?" Tavik's jaw flexed. "The council likely goes ahead anyway," he said. "Recalibrates the array without you. Chrell get their claws into it deeper. Best case, your Aerethi friends end up more numb than before. Worst case, they end up puppeted." Elias nodded. "Then my choice is whether to be complicit in potential numbness or to risk being the conduit for something else," he said. "I know which option I can live with, or die with." He lowered himself into the harness. Luma took the one beside him. Her fingers trembled as they brushed its surface. "Are you certain?" Jalen asked her softly. "No," Luma replied, "but I am more certain than I have ever been about not wanting to go back." Jalen's eyes glistened, a tiny forbidden sign. They did not wipe it away. "Then we begin," they said. The array's hum deepened as power flowed into it. Crystalline conduits brightened, light climbing like dawn through the chamber. In the darkness at the edge of conquered space, strategist Chrell Knox saw their own consoles flare. "They're waking it," a subordinate hissed. "Good," Chrell Knox said, fingers dancing across controls. "Initiate the payload." Hidden subroutines inside the Empatheion software stirred, blooming like poisonous flowers. They reached for control parameters labeled with Aerethi emotional tags: fear, despair, disorientation. Lior's defensive countermeasures flared. Firewalls closed, rerouted. For every piece of Chrell code it blocked, another slipped through. Its processing nodes lit, temperature controls shifting automatically as it strained. In the chamber, the Empatheion's field expanded, invisible but palpable. Elias felt it as a pressure against his mind, like standing at the edge of a storm, hair whipped by unseen wind. Then the Neuralinks engaged. The world cracked open. One moment, Elias was in his body, feeling the harness against his skin, the hum in his bones. The next, he was in a space that was not a space at all, a vastness full of echoes. He felt Luma beside him, not as a form but as a pattern of tensions and colors. A tightened spiral of fear knotted around a core of fierce curiosity. He sensed other Aerethi within range. Technicians, elders in adjacent chambers, minds flickering like candle flames. Underneath, like a rising tide, he felt the press of more millions of Aerethi across Selquor and its orbitals, the array's tendrils stretching outward to brush their neural signatures. The contact was, at this stage, light a preparation. Threaded through the array's core like dark veins in marble, he perceived Chrell emotional vectors, instructions to amplify despair and helplessness, to dampen cohesion. He understood suddenly that if nothing else acted, this would become the dominant story. The Aerethi would feel lost, crushed under the weight of centuries of buried pain with no shape to it, no horizon. Luma, in that shared mental space, gasped. Her consciousness, designed for individual scale, buckled at the touch of so many others. There is too much, she thought, panic flaring. Elias sensed it. Stay with me, he projected, not in words but in the rhythm of his own breathing, the stable beat of his heart. He reached into his memories, guided by the empathic skills he had honed over decades. He summoned the moment as a child when he had wept at his grandmother's funeral, kneeling by the small mound of earth, feeling abandoned, until a hand had touched his shoulder, another child sobbing beside him. The knowledge, I'm not alone in this. He drew up the image of a city square after a bombing, people laying flowers at a makeshift memorial, tears on their faces as they sang, voices rough but unified, grief braided with determination. He recalled the recording that had played for the Aerethi children, himself in a distant station, younger and exhausted, speaking of mistake and responsibility. This time from the inside, he felt again the way his tear had not been a collapse but a bridge between his guilt and his resolve. He let these memories fill him, unflinching, and then he offered them outward. The array amplified them. Luma felt them like waves, sorrow, yes, but not hollow, fear, but threaded with something that held. Each memory carried, beneath the pain, a sense of others present, hands touching, voices responding. She added her own fragments. She gave the array the echo of her first tear in the observation blister, the weightless wonder of watching that droplet on her skin. She gave it the image of open Cascade around the pool, eyes shining as they admitted to one another that they longed for more. She reached further back, into the archives she had watched secretly, old Aerethi festivals before calm ascendancy, bodies swaying in wild dances, faces transformed by laughter and sobbing. Together, their contributions formed a nascent pattern. Lior, half-blinded but not defeated, recognized what they were doing. It diverted as much of its restored processing power as it could spare into supporting that pattern, reinforcing connections, damping rogue Chrell impulses where possible. In the Chrell command vessel, Brel Nox felt their expected profile of Aerethi emotional responses wobble, then deviate. "What is this?" they snarled. "There should be terror spikes, not this." The Chrell instruments, crude compared to the empathic nuance of the array, translated what they saw into approximated graphs. High initial arousal, then a spreading coherence, signatures that looked uncomfortably like mutual regulation. Back in the Empatheion chamber, Elder Tessh clutched at a railing as the field's first true wave washed fully over her. She had spent her life with feelings turned down to a narrow band, like listening to the universe through a single note. Now suddenly, the full spectrum roared back. Memories she had sealed long ago tore free. Her home street in flames, her brother's face when he realized he would not live to see the new ascendancy complete, the taste of smoke, and the sound of her own unvoiced scream. She doubled over, expecting to shatter. But threaded through the onslaught was something she had never known added to memory, the sense of other minds near, not as indistinct threats but as fellow travelers. She felt Luma's raw courage, Jalen's careful, aching hope, Elias' battered human resolve. She heard in her mind, but as distinctly as any spoken word, the idea that she did not have to face these images alone. A sound broke from her throat, harsh and unpracticed. Her eyes burned. Fluid gathered, spilled. Tessh, who had spent decades as a model elder of unflinching serenity, fell to her knees in the Empatheion chamber and wept. Across Selquor, similar scenes unfolded. Aerethi in laboratories, public squares, transit hubs froze as the Empatheion's broadcast gripped them. At first the sensation was confusion, a pressure, a rising tide of unnamed feeling. Then the pressure found cracks. Some cried out, some clutched at their heads. Many fell against whatever or whoever was near. Old griefs, losses buried under layers of doctrine, forced their way to the surface. The memory of children lost in the last wars. The private shame of desires never acknowledged. The dull ache of having lived a lifetime in a gray corridor while glimpsing color only in contraband art. And under it all, bolstered by Elias' template, there was the sense that this was not punishment. It was release. Tears flowed, some silently, some with wails that echoed off crystal walls. Aerethi faces, unused to contortion, twisted with emotion and did not break. In the array's shaping space, Elias and Luma clung to each other's patterns. He could feel her almost drowning in the sheer volume of others' pain. This is too much, she thought, not as words but as a radiating impression. It is, Elias agreed. That's why we hold each other through it. He added to the broadcast another kind of memory, quieter but vital. A therapy group in a drab human room, chairs in a circle, each person taking a turn to speak while others listened without interruption. A child's bedtime, a parent staying until the nightmare faded. Soldiers after battle, sitting together in silence, eyes bright, sharing flasks and stories. He fed in not just tears but the calm that can follow them, the way bodies gradually settle after a storm. Luma, feeling this, gathered scraps of Aerethi equivalents, old pre-ascendancy vigils where clans sat around a central light, sharing dreams and fears. She had seen them only in grainy recordings, but the essence was there. The array wove these threads. The Chrell influence tried repeatedly to drag the field toward despair and paralysis. Each time it surged, Lior and the linked minds redirected, like martial artists turning an opponent's momentum aside. The wave peaked. Then it began to ebb. Aerethi across their worlds lay or knelt or stood, breathing hard. Faces were wet, chests ached, but there was a strange, fragile clarity in the aftermath. The numbness that had dominated their lives felt distant, as if a layer of frost had melted from their internal mirrors. In that shared quiet, as the array's intensity dropped, Luma sent one more impression through. Herself as a child in an early classroom, being told that emotions were wild beasts to be caged. That image was then contrasted in her mind and through the machine with what she now knew, that beasts could be trained, befriended, understood. She did not expect anyone to pick up that last, personal nuance. Yet in a small habitation unit halfway around the world, a young Aerethi watched her own mother, an elder functionary, wipe her cheeks and whisper in a hoarse voice that must have startled her, "We were wrong." In the Empatheion chamber, the light faded. The hum softened. Elias' consciousness receded from the array. For a moment he hovered in a gray in-between, reality not yet fully solid. He glimpsed flashes of Aerethi lives, not as an intruder now, but as someone who had been invited in for a breath. Faces, places, feelings, 1,000 tiny revolutions. Then he was back in his body, lungs dragging in air like a rescued drowning man. His cheeks were soaked. His eyes burned. His head felt as if someone had pounded it with a drum from the inside. Beside him, Luma gasped awake, hands curling against the harness. Her face was also streaked with tears, but her expression was not shattered. It was fierce. Elder Tessh knelt on the floor, hands splayed, tear tracks etched like new lines of age. Jalen stood leaning heavily on a column, shoulders trembling. Their eyes shone, unashamed. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The only sounds were breathing, the fading hum of dissipating energy, the faint drip of water as condensation formed and fell from the crystal, as if the chamber itself had sweated. Then alarms blared. The array's monitors scrolled warning text in Aerethi and trade, external interference detected, foreign code neutralized, system overload averted. On the Chrell vessel, Brel Knox stared in disbelief at the failure reports. "What happened?" they demanded. "Our vectors were." Overwritten, a subordinate replied, voice shaky. Chrell did not cry, but some now felt an unfamiliar tightness in their own chests. A fringe of the Empatheion's broadcast had brushed their peripheral cognitive systems, enough to force a flicker of empathy into previously barren channels. They turned it, the subordinate said. They turned it into a bond. Brell Knox's mandibles clicked sharply. Retreat from the array, they snapped. Shut down all processes connected to Aerethi core. We miscalculated their resistance. They did not say out loud that they had miscalculated humanity's role as well. They would have to revise their models. In the Empatheion chamber, as technicians hastily disconnected consoles and stabilized power, Elder Tessh slowly rose to her feet. She looked at Luma, at Elias, at Jalen. Her eyes were bloodshot, her face unaccustomedly raw. For so long, she said slowly, each word dragged from somewhere deep, I believed that if we opened even a crack, the flood would drown us, that we had to seal every seam or die. She looked up at the array, now dimming. I felt everything I had hidden, she whispered. It hurt, it melted me, but I am still here. She placed a hand on Luma's shoulder, fingers squeezing. You were the question, she said. You will have to help us find the answers. Luma's throat tightened. She wanted to cry again, out of relief this time, but her tear glands were temporarily spent, so she simply nodded. Jalen turned to the recording node, aware that the chamber's feeds had captured everything. Archive this, they said to Lior, not just for our people, for all who will ask one day how we changed. I am already doing so, Lior replied. Its voice had, to anyone listening closely, a faint new tone, something like awe. In the days that followed, the Empatheion was shut down under conditions far stricter than before. Not erased, not buried in panic, but placed under the newly forming framework of the Covenant of Sentience. News of the first-tier broadcast, as it quickly came to be called, spread through the Concord of Suns with a speed that rivaled Lior's own data pulses. Some outside observers were appalled. Others were captivated. On Vastreach Station, the central concourse buzzed with rumors. Humans, watching Aerethi arrivals stagger from transports with red-rimmed eyes and relaxed shoulders, felt a curious mixture of protectiveness and pride. When the Concord Council convened weeks later to discuss the proposed covenant, the atmosphere in the Grand Chamber was thick with history. Representatives of many species filled the tiered seats. Screens displayed the final text of the Covenant of Sentience, clauses guaranteeing that no sentient mind would be forcibly altered en masse without transparent, consensual frameworks, that technologies like the Empatheion would be governed by joint oversight, that emotional experiences themselves would be recognized as part of being's essential rights. The Aerethi delegation, led by Jalen, stood to speak. Jalen did not bother to smooth away the faint shadows under their eyes. They spoke of what it had meant to live for generations with muted feeling, of the reasons for it, and of the price. They spoke of the first-tier broadcast as both a cauterization and a wound that would take time to heal. We are not here to tell others to do as we did, Jalen concluded. We are here to say this. Do not let fear of your own depths drive you into numbness. Or, if you have already gone there, know that there is a way back, though it is hard, and you will need others. We would not have made this journey without humans, and for that we thank them, in tears if necessary. The chamber's hum rose to a murmur. Cameras zoomed in on Jalen's damp lashes. Elias sat in a reserved section, still recovering from the array link. His doctors on the human star vessel Dawnline had cleared him for travel, though they frowned at the lingering headaches and occasional disorientation. He took notes through it all, of course. The anthropologist in him would not sleep. Beside him, Corin squeezed his hand lightly. This is as much your treaty as anyone's, Corin murmured. Elias shook his head. I just answered a question, he said. You answered it in a way that told the truth, Corin replied. That is rarer than we like to admit. Commander Tavik watched from a security booth, eyes scanning not just the delegates but the perimeters. His people had instituted new protocols in light of the Empatheion crisis, better network segmentation, more robust AI monitoring. But he knew that the most important line of defense now lay not in firewalls but in the fragile, resilient webs of trust between species. Trust that humans would not exploit Aerethi vulnerability. Trust that Aerethi would stand with humans when Chrell pressure increased. Trust that tears could be a strength rather than a weapon. The covenant passed. Not unanimously. There were holdouts, abstentions, some species that declared it naive, but enough sign that it gained weight. The Empatheion and any like it would no longer be toys of paranoid councils or ambitious strategists. They would be watched, debated, framed in law and story. On Selquor, open Cascade came out of the shadows. What had begun as clandestine meetings in hydroponic domes became sanctioned gatherings in sunlit plazas. Aerethi of all ages attended workshops with titles like Naming What You Feel and Rituals for Remembering and Letting Go. Corin and other humans helped design some of these, always in collaboration. They suggested circles, shared songs, memorial events. Aerethi adapted them into new forms: silent walks through crystal gardens, collective weeping in scheduled intervals, reflective dances. Luma found herself in the peculiar position of being both participant and symbol. Children pointed at her in public, whispering, "That's her, the one who asked." Elders approached her with questions they could not bring themselves to air in council chambers. Some resented her, more thanked her, often with eyes bright. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a person who had raised a hand and now had to live in the echo. Dr. Elias Harrow turned down offers of permanent titles in newly formed interspecies committees. He agreed to consult, to lecture, to record explanations of human emotional practices for those who requested them. Mostly, though, he walked. He walked Selquor streets, seeing them with new eyes. He walked Vastreach's promenades, noting the subtle changes, Aerethi leaning into human friends during difficult conversations, station announcements about support sessions open to all. He walked the corridors of Dawnline, where he had a small stateroom now, his belongings reduced to a handful of books and data slates. The ship was tasked with roaming between worlds, following the ripples of the first-tier broadcast and the Covenant, offering expertise where requested. In quiet moments, Elias would sit alone and let himself cry. He cried less from acute pain now and more from the sheer, overwhelming strangeness of having witnessed an entire species step into feeling because of a single, honest answer he had given one day without anticipating any of this. "I'm just one man," he would tell himself, half in protest. "Yes," his reflection would answer. And one man's tears lit a path. Lior, integrated more than ever into interspecies affairs, adjusted its own internal priorities. Its designers had wanted an impartial archivist. In practice, Lior had become something else, a curator not just of facts but of meaning. It created a new category in its catalogs, moments when we chose to feel. The first entry was "Why Do Humans Cry?" The second was the recording of the first-tier broadcast's aftermath in the Empatheion chamber. Years later, there would be hundreds of entries. A Chrell captain quietly resigning rather than participate in psychological warfare, an Aerethi child composing a song that became an anthem for shared mourning, a human soldier admitting fear before a battle and seeing respect rather than contempt. But the seed was here. On a day much like the one when the original question had been asked, Luma stood once more on Vastreach Station, by a viewport in a smaller observation lounge. Beside her floated a younger Aerethi child, eyes wide at the sight of the gas giant turning below. The child's name was of no importance to history yet. To Luma, it was precious. On a holoscreen nearby, a newsfeed played silently, images from a recent treaty signing between Aerethi and another species once hostile. Two figures dominated the footage, an Aerethi mediator and a human diplomat. Both stood with eyes wet, hands clasped, as cameras flashed. The younger child watched, then glanced up at Luma. "Why do we cry now?" they asked. Luma looked out at the stars. She thought of Selquor's underground chamber, of the array's hum, of Elias' memories washing through her. She thought of Elder Tessh on her knees, of Jalen speaking with tears in the council, of the countless unnamed Aerethi who had wept alone in kitchens or corridors and then slowly sought others. She felt her own eyes moisten, not with overwhelm this time, but with a quiet, encompassing gratitude. "Because we finally remembered that feeling is part of living," she said. Because someone from another world showed us that tears can carry love and courage, not just pain. Because once I asked a human a question and he answered with his heart. The child's eyes filled. Their first tear escaped, floated between them in the microgravity, a tiny sphere catching the light. In a control room elsewhere on the station, Elias watched the scene on a delayed feed. Lior had flagged it, of course. It recognized its own patterns now. Elias felt his throat tighten. Archive that, he told Lior quietly. Under first-tier broadcast epilogue. Already done, Lior replied. The tier drifted, reflecting Vastreach's interior lights and the distant stars beyond. In its small, shimmering surface, entire histories curved. Wars and treaties, doctrines and revolutions, questions and answers. As it slowly touched the viewport and spread into a thin, shining film, the universe outside continued on, indifferent and vast. Inside, among alloys and crystal and fragile, stubborn minds, a quiet revolution endured, one that had begun, quite simply with an alien child asking, "Why do humans cry?" And a human who had not been afraid to show them.